What does NATO really want with its proxy war in Ukraine? Because after hundreds of billions of dollars, tens of thousands of lives lost, Colonel McGregor on our show saying he believes that number is well or nearing 2 million lives lost. No clear end in sight. It's fair to ask, what is the actual goal here in Ukraine from NATO? And just as importantly, how did the Democrats become the party of war? The same party that once rallied against Vietnam, rallied against the Iraq War, called out the injustices of millions of people being killed in those Middle East boondoggles, funding endless conflicts in Eastern Europe, punishing anyone who dared question it. Now suddenly, it's the opposite. To help us make sense of this, we're joined by James Carden. He's the editor of the Realist Review on Substack, former advisor to the U.S. State Department on U.S.-Russia relations. He reported extensively from Ukraine, Russia, the Caucasus, across Europe. He's uniquely positioned to answer this. Also, he's got an upcoming book titled The Great Betrayal, How the Democrats Became the Party of War. James, welcome to the show. I'm excited to talk with you.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. So the new book, The Great Betrayal, How the Democrats Became the Party of War, that's going to be published next year. So you're still putting the finishing touches on that. I'd love to talk with you about that because it hits home for me as a guy who back in the day voted for these guys, voted for, Bill Clinton my first time at University of Pittsburgh. That was the first time I could vote. And anti-war positions, anti-big government positions, anti-massive military industrial complex positions, like all of these things I hold dear, and now it's the opposite. So I want to get there in a moment. But I think it's time. Maybe we have an assessment of what's going on in Ukraine. There's been a number of big stories that have unfolded over the past few days. 60-year-olds now being allowed to fight in this proxy war. 14-year-olds now being trained, but I believe they'll probably be thrown into white vans and thrown to the front lines. Is anyone going to be checking their identifications? So what is NATO's mission now that they've lost so much land? They're refusing to move towards a ceasefire. What is NATO's mission in Ukraine at this stage?
I think NATO's mission in Ukraine is very clear. It's to drag the United States in and to keep the United States in and to keep Trump in. And I think so far they've been wildly successful in that, much more successful than those of us who had hoped that Donald Trump would be pulling the plug on this thing. Unfortunately, Donald Trump seems intent on following the Biden playbook in Ukraine. And that's a terribly depressing commentary. But, NATO has played him masterfully. They're going to agree to spend, between 3 and 5% of their, GDP on defense expenditures. And we're going to keep everything going as it was. So, their plan is to keep us in. Not unlike really the original plan for NATO to begin with, right? Which was to keep the Germans down, the Russians out, and the Americans in, right? So sort of the same rationale is happening today.
So then what is the end game? It's just a perpetual state of war? Because you know it better than anyone. You've spent so much time there. You've covered this. Does NATO honestly think that it can beat Russia, or is this just some sort of war of attrition, just like a slow death of Russia by kind of bleeding them dry with sanctions that haven't worked? I just don't understand.
Yeah, I think it is. I think the intent is to try to bleed the Russian economy dry. The ultimate aim is not victory on the battlefield, because not even they are so insane or stupid to think that they can achieve that. The ultimate goal of NATO and American policy over the past 25 years has always been regime change in Moscow. That's the whole point. That's the point of NATO expansion. That is the point of every American policy that we've pursued over the past 25 years. Biden himself, standing in Warsaw right after the war started in 2022, said, "My God, this man cannot remain president of Russia." So the idea shared by Washington and European elites is regime change in Russia. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, if we're being honest, if our leaders, our elites are being honest with them, we don't care about them. We are using them. They are cannon fodder. And that's what makes this even more atrocious.
You know, I voted for President Trump. I voted for Trump because I wanted an end to these wars. Exactly what I sort of talked about at the beginning. You know, I'm vehemently anti-war, and the vowing of us getting out of Ukraine and out of this boondoggle within the first 24 to 48 hours of his presidency. He was even asked right after the inauguration, Mr. President, you said after 24 hours you would be out of this thing. And he said, well, I've got some parties to go to. I've got, you know, I'm still within the first day. Allow me some time. Well, now we're well beyond 100 days in office. Seems like it's getting worse. 60-year-olds being conscripted, 14-year-olds going into this mess. And then this morning, President Trump says he vows to pull the U.S. out of this mess in Ukraine, and he's working hard right now to withdraw the U.S. from this mess. Do you buy that argument? Do you buy that story?
I think part of the story might be true. He did just send Steve Witkoff over to meet with Putin. They just met. The readout of the talks are not yet available. On the other hand, Ukraine is certainly losing the war of attrition on the ground. The casualty numbers that we get from the New York Times and the Washington Post are lies. They are every bit as false as the body count numbers that the U.S. used to send through the media during the Vietnam War. Russia just had a very significant battlefield victory in Ukraine. They're slowly moving. But for the Russians, see, when people on MSNBC and CNN talk about, you know, how slowly the Russians are moving and, you know, they're not really succeeding, they're missing the point. For Russia, it's a war of attrition. They're killing as many Ukrainians as they possibly can, and they're doing a damn good job. You know, the casualty numbers in Ukraine are probably over 1 million. So for the Russians right now, it isn't really about the capture of territory. It's about the killing of Ukrainians. And in that way, they're succeeding. The way Trump is going about this is kind of the way Trump goes about everything, very haphazardly. So on the one hand, he sends Witkoff to talk to Putin to hopefully ratchet down tensions. On the other hand, he's busy getting the rest of the world involved with this, with his policy of secondary sanctions. So just, you know, this morning, he, issued a 25% tariff on India to punish India for buying Russian oil. So on the one hand, he's trying to contain it. On the other hand, he's trying to pressure other countries into stopping their, trade with Russia. That isn't going to work. So, you know, it's hard to see a lot of sense in Trump's strategy to end the war here. I frankly think that he's being played by the Europeans, and the Europeans know how to play to his vanity. And so,
yeah, it's interesting because over the past few weeks, it's all the story about the United States that the EU made a bent the knee to President Trump, and they got really, kind of spanked, if you will, by the master, the art of the deal. But you believe the EU is really playing Trump in all of this?
Yeah, I think NATO is playing Trump in all of this. I think that they've been successful in keeping him in, and he basically has turned his back on his campaign promises. He campaigned, as you well know, as basically a candidate of peace. Under Biden, we had, full-on support for what Israel was doing in Gaza. We were involved deeply in this proxy war to the point of actually having men on the ground in Ukraine. Biden lied continually about what he was doing. So Trump kind of campaigned as a quasi-peace candidate. And what have we gotten over the past 6 months? War in Iran, support for Israel and Gaza, and continued support for Ukraine. So, it's so far been a very disappointing 6 months. But no one has any right, I think, to be surprised because look at who he surrounded himself with. This is a cabinet of hawks, with the exception of Tulsi Gabbard. This is a cabinet that basically leans very neoconservative. And so if you surround yourself with people like that, you're not going to get good policy. So instead of having what we ought to have, which is a national security advisor, McGregor, we are getting, national security advisor Rubio. Well, Rubio is a career neocon. So we
Right.
can't be surprised by any of this, unfortunately.
No, in the first few days of Rubio being in play, I was vehemently anti-Rubio, as a neocon. I thought there's no way, a leopard, does a leopard have stripes? Yeah, spots. A leopard has spots. A leopard can't change its spots, right? And so, but in the first few days, he was, flying to Latin America. He was talking about America First policy. He was going to. So I was like, what's going on here? We're all sort of being duped by this. Maybe we should talk about some strategy and tactics right now. So as you talked about Ukraine, if you look at eastern Ukraine, the area where Ukraine had been carrying out a genocide against ethnic Russians since about 2014, since the Maidan coup, killing, bombing civilian playgrounds, schools. The Western media was pretty silent on the whole story. Of course, this was all CIA backed and run. So this was in an effort to, I think, provoke Russia. Everyone was surprised. Then suddenly Putin invades after parliament signs off on it. They move into what was eastern Ukraine to protect ethnic Russians. That line has moved a bit. It's continuing to move. There are some indications that, as you mentioned, the Western media loves to play this idea that Putin's like bogged down. They're just
Right.
slowly dragging their feet along. But almost, talk about the Ukrainian army being wiped away. And what is the goal on both sides at this stage for Russia? What is the goal for the Russian army? Is it to take Odessa? Is it to take Kiev? Is it to completely take over the country to put an end to this? Or will they just stop at that eastern Ukraine, what was eastern Ukrainian line along the Dnieper, and say, we're done now?
Well, I think it's the latter. They would be insane to want to try to take over the entire country. They would be faced with a massive and brutal guerrilla warfare campaign in Western Ukraine that would go on for a generation. I don't think that was ever their intent. They've been very clear about their red lines, right? And that's something that we as Americans have a habit of ignoring. When Putin's been now in the Kremlin for a quarter of a century, one of the things that he and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, have always said to the former republics of the Soviet Union that are now independent, very much including Ukraine. If you go back to when the Soviet Union fell, it fell almost in an instant. And so what happened over the Christmas holidays, 1991, 1992, is that 25 million ethnic Russians were all of a sudden stranded in foreign countries that weren't their own. So all of these constituent republics of the Soviet Union have very sizable ethnic Russian minorities. Putin has been very clear, do not abuse, do not mistreat those Russian minorities, or we are going to get involved. No secret. The Ukrainians have ignored that again and again and again. They've tried to disenfranchise them. They've tried to terrorize them. I'm glad that you brought up what was going on in the Donbass in 2014 and 2015. I was there in 2015. I was in Donetsk. I talked to people. They were shocked. These are ethnic Russians, but they were Ukrainian patriots. And they were shocked at the way that they were being portrayed and the way that they were being treated by Petro Poroshenko, who was then the Ukrainian president. People would come up to me and say, do you see what they're calling us? They're calling us terrorists. And indeed they were. Poroshenko launched what was called an anti-terrorist operation against his own people. There was no way that the Kremlin was going to stand for that. And you're exactly right. They were using weapons provided by us to bomb schools, hospitals. I saw grandparents living in bombed out Cold War era nuclear fallout shelters. I went to a hospital and I saw troops with cut off legs and cut off arms. in Donetsk. I mean, it was appalling. And it was all Russia's fault if you read the New York Times or turned on CNN or MSNBC. But none of that was true. So no one can be surprised that finally, after the Minsk process failed, Putin, decided to invade. They're not going for the entire country. The Russians see it almost as a rescue operation to save
Right.
the Russian minority populations that have been serially abused by the regime in Kiev. And by the way, Americans really ought to bone up on what the nature of that regime, the nature of the regime in Kiev. They could begin by finding out what actually happened on the Maidan in February of 2014. That was a operation carried out by far-right ethno-nationalist fascists, particularly something called Right Sector, and they shot into a crowd of peaceful protesters. It was a false flag operation. And that inevitably caused the coup that overthrew a democratically elected president of Ukraine. And they wanted to get rid of this president, first of all, because he was an ethnic Russian and he was from the Party of Regions, which has its support in the Donbass. They wanted to get rid of him because he didn't want to pursue EU membership, and he signed a trade deal with Putin. And the terms of the trade deal with Putin were far better than the austerity-laden deal that he was going to have to sign with the EU. So they took to the streets and they overthrew this guy. But overthrowing a democratically elected president is not democracy. It's the opposite of democracy. And so this has been a long time in coming, and it's a terrible tragedy for the people of Ukraine. But we're partially responsible for it because we encouraged it. And that's what's so terrible about it.
I mean, there's videos, I think, of Senator McCain, like maybe Victoria Nuland, I think, in the windows watching like the coup unfolding on the ground over Maidan Square, looking down.
McCain and Christopher Murphy of Connecticut, so it was a bipartisan effort, and they traveled there and they spoke to the crowds, and Nuland, encouraged it. And we were always sending CODELs there, right? Congressional delegation. We were always sending these people like Lindsey Graham, Amy Klobuchar, all these, the late Joe Lieberman, all of these people. It was part of the post-Cold War color revolution playbook. And it instead of doing what we should have done and negotiated and come to realize that, okay, what are America's actual interests in who governs the Donbass and who governs Eastern Ukraine, right? I don't remember. We're both children of the late Cold War. I don't remember, right, in the 80s, anyone losing a lot of sleep as to whether Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union or not. Now, there was kind of more concern in terms of the Baltic states because they had been independent, right? And then you had, concerns over Poland, but they weren't part of the Soviet Union, and Hungary, and on and on. Ukraine has always been a constituent part of the Russian Empire. So that, this idea that, Ukraine, which has been independent from 1992 to now, should be and should stay in the form that it had been for only 30 years seems to me pretty silly. And it's certainly a silly thing to risk, nuclear confrontation over.
You brought up something really important, which is the catastrophe for Ukraine, and I don't want to gloss over that. So think about this. If you're just sit back for a second and just sort of like let this wash over you as a viewer of this. If Colonel Douglas Macgregor's numbers are correct and 1.8 million have been killed, not casualties with maimed arms and legs, but killed in Ukraine. I mean, multiple generations wiped away. They can't build graveyards quickly enough, right? So that's sort of the backdrop for all of this. The fact that they had a democratically elected president who wanted to keep the peace, had a trade deal with Putin, who wanted to protect the people of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk and those areas, making sure that they weren't being targeted by, neo-fascists and being killed and bombed in playgrounds. They could have had peace. They could have had prosperity. Young people would have lived, an entire generation, multiple generations would be alive today. But the CIA, MI6 meddling, forcing their hand into a coup that puts in place a Western-backed government and leads to this destruction. I mean, it's so upsetting.
I don't know if you've ever heard of or had on a gentleman by the name of Dr. Michael Vlahos. He's a military historian, and by his estimates, the casualties that Ukraine are now suffering are comparable or worse to the casualty rates that France suffered during the First World War. I mean, this is an astounding, as you say, this is going to wipe out generations. And what kind of future have we now laid out for our friends in Ukraine? Okay, so you have millions dead, millions more wounded. What you also have are tens of millions of people who fled, who are not going to come back. And then what you have is, in terms of sending all of these weapons and all this money to a corrupt elite, a corrupt oligarchy there, basically what you've turned this into is an arms bazaar in the center of Europe. So think about what we did to Kosovo. Kosovo is now a black hole, black market for arms deals, human organ smuggling. It's given Saudi Arabia a foothold in the middle of Europe. But Kosovo is a relatively small area. We're turning, by land size, Europe's largest country into like a supersized kind of Kosovo. So what we're doing is we've constructed for ourselves an enormous security problem that the Europeans and us, because we pay for everything, are going to have to deal with for generations. All over.
On purpose.
As you say,
on purpose, correct? I mean, that's on purpose.
Well, it's the, result of these policies. But as you pointed out, all over what? A trade deal. A trade deal in the winter of 2013. This is the result. And this is what you get when you have foreign policy run by the neocons in Washington. And the problem is that, at least in terms of DC and the Uniparty, is that the neocons have not only, basically control foreign policy, whatever people think about Trump and America First, they are still very much in control of the foreign policy apparatus in the Republican Party. And during the late Obama years, made a transition and then took over the foreign policy apparatus of the Democratic Party. So there's no fresh thinking, there's no new thinking. And people who think that, Donald Trump's America First has fundamentally transformed and changed the Republican Party. And now the Republican Party is neo-isolationist, it's America First, and all that stuff. I wish that were the case. It certainly isn't. And you can see that, as I said before, in his appointments, but you can also see that on Capitol Hill. There's been no sea change here. Out in the country, there has been. His voters are, America First. His voters don't want any part of this. But within the Republican Party is still the party of Mitch McConnell and John McCain and Mitt Romney on Capitol Hill, and of course among the big funders and among the big think tanks.
That's why there was such a coordinated effort by the Uniparty, by the neoconservative movement to try to get Trump out of this and to not.
Certainly.
Seems like he's been going along with it. So when I see videos overnight of kids partying in Kharkiv in Ukraine, and nightlife it's 20 miles away from the front lines, there's partying going on. Nightlife in Kiev seems like it's good. Everything's rocking and rolling. People are out at clubs and all of that. Is that disconnected from reality? Like when I see these videos and like what, you know it better than anyone, but what are the young people, how do they feel about like the United States? Are they aware that like, and NATO, like, are they aware that this is our proxy war, that we are using them for our own
No,
ends?
no, I don't think so. I mean, the mindset in Western Ukraine is that of extreme nationalism. Now, they may not want to go to the front line, and who can blame them, but they are extremely anti-Russian, extremely pro-European, pro-American. I kind of laughed when you brought up the nightlife in Kiev because it brought to mind one of the more disgusting things that I think happened during the Biden administration, and that's a long list. But you may recall that perhaps our least competent Secretary of State in American history, Antony Blinken, traveled many times to Ukraine. And one of those times, in the midst of a war, that was, and continues to kill hundreds of thousands of
He brought his
Ukraine.
guitar.
Yes, sir. Yep, he certainly did. He brought his guitar and decided to play some blues at a nightclub in Kiev. And I thought that that was seriously one of the more sickening things that a top American diplomat has ever done. And then, of course, he outdid himself months later, basically becoming a member of the war cabinet in Jerusalem.
What kind of vacuum has been created in Ukraine? We've covered extensively here on the show the massive child sex trafficking operations, the sex trafficking operations, the groups that have moved women in and around, the baby making factories, the womb, selling out women's wombs basically to foreign investors who want for $5,000 and so forth. We've shown the baby factories essentially inside of Ukraine. This is a story that the mainstream media ignores, of course, at all costs. They'll never touch this story. Let's talk about the dark side of this. What do you know about that?
I don't know that much about it. I believe it. It does not surprise me. What you have is an economy that has been utterly obliterated. You have tens of millions of people who have fled that country. You have mass destruction. And you have, as I said before, a unbelievably avaricious, selfish, corrupt Ukrainian elite that is in cahoots with their partners in Berlin and in Paris and in London and in Washington. So it would take a lot to surprise me with regard to what is actually going on there. And we should feel as Americans deeply ashamed that we not only helped start the catastrophe, but have continued to fund the catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken with ex-CIA Tim Ballard, who was sort of the inspiration for the movie, Sound of Silence, I think, or I forget the name of the film. Jim Caviezel played, and he said, Ukraine was like ground zero before the war for child sex trafficking. It was really the nexus where these children would be ferreted out of Ukraine into Latin America, and I can only imagine because these perverts, this operation operates in chaos. Is it safe to say that Ukraine as a country is chaotic, is chaos at a government level and at an infrastructure level? And, you think about like trash being picked up on time on a Tuesday at 9 a.m. in America, like you put out your trash cans on a Monday night. Like, do these things run on time in Ukraine?
I think calling it a center of European chaos would be probably an understatement. But with regard to the trafficking, you're not going to get any sort of recognition by the American elite about that because they won't even admit the simple things. So let me give you an example from 10 years ago. Now, I hope that your viewers realize this has been going on for over a decade. The war didn't start in February of 2022. All of this started in February of 2014. So during the Obama administration, for some time, covered Congress. And so I attended a hearing, and this was in 2015. during the anti-terrorist operation. American funded, carried out by Kiev against what were ostensibly its own citizens. So it was the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and sitting in the witness chair was Samantha Power, UN ambassador. And a Republican congressman asked her, "Are you aware that Kiev is using American ordnance and munitions to bomb schools and houses and hospitals in the Donbass?" And she looked right at him and said, "I am not aware of any of those reports." She basically flat out lied to Congress. And so if you're not going to get a simple recognition over something like that, you'll never get them to admit something as gruesome and as horrible as child sex trafficking in Ukraine. They will sweep that under the rug.
When it was all being facilitated, of course, by Alejandro Mayorkas, Antony Blinken. I mean, Antony Blinken lied right to members of Congress's face about freezing the visas for these Guatemalan individuals who were trying to put an end to the child sex trafficking flowing out of Guatemala into the United States. We reported on that. He lied right to Congress's face. The whole reason that he froze their visas was exactly that, to stop the flow of these children. So they are complicit in this. And you're right. We're never going to get answers on this. Although it's part of the congressional testimony now on record that they were the largest facilitators of this. So I wouldn't be surprised at all that he's welcomed with open arms and a guitar into Kiev. Let's talk about the Democratic Party. Obviously, you're writing a book on this, putting the finishing touches on this, being released next year in the Democratic Party. As I talked about at the beginning, I think the appeal for me is like an anti-war person, and as a student of American history, I vehemently anti-war. And so my support at the time as a young college kid was, I'm not going to support George H.W. Bush, a guy who, former CIA, facilitated our involvement in Iraq. My brother went to Iraq in the first Gulf War. He was there in Baghdad. I'm not going to support that. I want to be out of these wars.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we're all duped and brought along. We know what happened in Kosovo. We know what happened in Serbia under Bill Clinton's watch around the world in different locations. And it was continued. So how did the Democratic Party lose its way? Or was it always this way? Has it always been a uniparty and we have been misled?
So for much of not to go through the whole thing, but the premise of my book is that history changed on April 12th, 1945. That's when Roosevelt died and Truman became president. Truman launched an entirely unnecessary Cold War and is almost single-handedly responsible for building up the national security state, even as it stands today. During most of the history from the 80 years...
He recognized Israel. He was also the first person to...
That's an entire other,
Yeah.
You could write an entire other book about the Democratic Party's history with Israel. There was one Democratic president, I just will mention this, who did try to stand up to the Israel lobby. His name was Kennedy. Something happened to him. So for most of the 80 years, there was at least a healthy competition within the party. So I kind of frame it like this. You had the party of Roosevelt, who wanted to, he kind of enshrined concepts like diplomacy and dialogue and cooperation and reciprocity in the UN Charter. And then you had the party of Truman, the party of war, the party of the hard line, right? And so you had kind of give and take. You had, Truman, and then the next Democratic president after Truman was Kennedy. Kennedy, gets ushered out of the picture, and then you get Johnson. So you had kind of, Kennedy's Rooseveltian instincts coming through towards the end. Johnson comes back, party of Truman back in charge, right? So, we can go through this, but in our present day, right? So you were talking about, how you looked at things in the 90s and stuff. So I was one of these Obama cons. Do you remember the Obama cons? So they were conservatives who were going to support Obama because we viewed him as anti-war. So I was personally extremely alarmed by George W. Bush's 2005 inaugural address, where it was like Woodrow Wilson come to life. And we have to go around the world in search of monsters to destroy. And I thought,
Right.
that seems to me to be a very bad idea. And then John McCain said, we're all Georgians now. And I thought, oh, great. Now we're going to, fight the Cold War again. So I thought Obama was the only option. And conservatives did, like the conservatives at the American Conservative said, okay, we're going to back Obama. He's the anti-war candidate. Didn't turn out that way. Right. So Obama campaigned as a member of the party of Roosevelt, but quickly showed his true colors. And he was captured by the national security state. And the national security state is indeed the party of Truman. And so what happened was that once Obama was, not even before he was sworn into office, he backtracked on being a peace candidate. Who was his first appointment? Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State. So the national security state, the merger of the Democrats and the national security state really began after Obama took office. And it deepened and deepened and deepened until you get to 2016 and you have people like Robert Kagan coming out publicly supporting Hillary Clinton's candidacy. And then the merger between the Democrats and the national security state became just too obvious to ignore during Russiagate. So what you've had now is the party of Roosevelt is gone. It's nowhere to be found. And what you have is the triumph of the party of Truman. And so it was a slow process beginning on April 12th, 1945. But ultimately, the party of Roosevelt is dead. I mean, if you can't get someone like Bernie Sanders to early on condemn what the Israelis were doing in Gaza, you don't have it.
Right.
So even the progressives today are, by my way of looking at things, warmongers. And they've been totally on board with the new Cold War and that project. So it tells the very depressing, but I hope interesting story of how the Democratic Party transformed and kind of merged ultimately with the permanent state, with the national security state.
So that's at the heart of it then. It's the permanent government. It's you might call it the deep state, but it really is just the permanent government. It's the security state. It's the massive military industrial complex that feeds off of this. And
there was one administration that saw this clearly, and it was the Kennedy administration. And one of Kennedy's closest advisors was a Harvard historian named Arthur Schlesinger. And Schlesinger was ultimately put in charge of a plan to reorganize the CIA, and that plan was kept secret for many years. Schlesinger, in a lecture at Harvard in 1962, it was actually something hosted by Henry Kissinger, who was a professor there, and Schlesinger told these people who were at this seminar about the permanent state. And Schlesinger said, look, we don't have 3 branches of government anymore. We have 4. We have the courts, we have the Congress, we have the presidency, and we have the permanent state. And he said that people kind of misunderstand. They think that because the country has grown more powerful, that the presidency has grown more powerful. But it's not the case, because the permanent state acts often as a check on the president. So you have a permanent state that's acting as a check on a democratically elected president. And that's what we've seen. So, but they knew very well what they were facing. And that's why Kennedy was a danger to the national security state. It may also be why he was the last Democratic president who you could rightfully fit into the party of Roosevelt. And
how America changed on that day in Dallas. I think permanently. I don't see us being able to walk it back. You see the influence, though, even though we don't have a Democratic president right now. I mean, you see this permanent government's hands all over Trump. I just got a message from a trusted source who's very close to the president, who says really deeply disturbed at the alignment of these neocons and the permanent state sort of around Trump. And it's very, very strong, and it's on purpose.
Do you know when I knew it was over pretty much for this administration? When he put Radcliffe in its CIA. You can't expect to address or even hope to fight off the national security state if you put someone in charge of it who's in love with it.
Right.
DNI is basically, I don't know what's going to happen with DNI, but that's not where the power is. So if you put someone like Radcliffe in charge of CIA, and then you put someone like Hegseth in charge of the Pentagon, the fight is over even before the bell rings.
I'll get you out of here on this, James, which is, what do you see for the rest of Trump's presidency here? Do you see more of the same, more of sort of like drip, drip, drip? We're going to release documents. We're going to be transparent, but more alignment with Zelensky, more alignment with Bibi Netanyahu, keeping us in NATO, keeping us strong in all of those areas that have been controlled by the Truman Group since after World War II.
I think it would take a person of enormous internal strength, intellect, and resources to take all that on. I don't really see any evidence that Trump is that person. He's shown flashes of it. But again, you cannot have an administration and you cannot craft a responsible, sane, even minimally ethical foreign policy with the people that he has appointed. So I see a lot of dark days ahead, unfortunately.
My guest has been James Carden. His new book is coming out, The Great Betrayal, How the Democrats Became the Party of War. I'd love to have you back on. We can deep dive more on the Democrats when that book hits store shelves next year, but I wanted to really get an assessment of your deep knowledge on Ukraine and where things stand right now. So, James, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.